So guys, I'm at the part where I need to start making the brace that goes across the chassis where the top portion of the shock absorbers are going to mount to. Now I've got my wooden jig, I'm going to call it here, which is really just holding the top of the shock absorber in place, and it's giving me a way to just mock up by moving this wood around and adjusting a couple of things to get an idea of where I need to mount the upper portion of this shock absorber. I need to now fabricate the piece of steel that's going to run across here for the two shock absorbers to mount to. I've roughly laid it out, and I mean roughly. I don't know if you can even see here. These two lines, this line represents the base of the chassis. This line represents how high it needs to be. That little tick mark shows me how far over it needs to be. This is my center line, so it's real vague. It's real vague. I've got my sample bend here, which I can set on here onto the top, and then set it to where it just intersects the end point there. Then with this, you can start laying out the piece. I don't need to get too crazy laying it out on this drawing. This drawing is just going to give me really my endpoints, and I'll show you that as I fab it up. But what I'm going to do is just make a generic bend on one end that is less than 90 degrees, but close to. It's probably going to be somewhere around 80 degrees. I'm going to count it on my bender, and I'll show you. I've got some notches some markings that I made on my tubing bender so that I can do this, because it's easier for me to replicate a bend not going by the angle, but going by how many cranks I did on the tubing bender, than if I actually drew this out and said I want both ends of this to be at 92 degrees. That would be much more difficult than if I just make a generic bend at what on my bender is going to be like maybe a 4-2, and I'll show you what I'm talking about on my bender. I'm just going to make a generic bend at 4-2 or whatever it comes out to be, and then I'm just going to be able to copy that on the other side by laying out that generic bend I made, calculating where I need to start it, and then replicating it with my tubing bender by just going to a 4-2 again. And again, I'll show you that as I do it, but it's a really good way to replicate bends when you don't have to be exactly to a certain degree. I've got one tie off this way that goes and connects to an anchor on the garage footing, and then I've got another anchor at the front here that runs back to another anchor on the footing. This way, I can pull on it this way, and as the handle comes around, it also has a tendency to be pulled this way, so these two ropes keep it from being able to go this way and this way. You still have to kind of slide it around a little bit as you're working it, but it's doable. I mean, that was 1.5 inch 095 DOM, so that's about the thickest that I do, so it's manageable. Now if you look, this is a JD squared tubing bender. On the bar that you can ratchet, it has these indentations, and what I did is I numbered all of the indentations, and then on the die here it's got these different holes that you can put the pin in to move the bar that forms it around. The way I consider it is, if my pin is in this hole, I'd call that a 1. If my pin is in this hole, it's a 2. If it's in the next hole, it's a 3. If it's in the next hole, it's a 4. So what I do is, I broke this all the way around on the first hole. Then I started breaking it on the second hole. And I broke it all the way up to a 5. I was on the second hole, number 5. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna write on here 5 by 2. Now what that tells me is that this break was a 5 by 2. So now that break is easily replicatable if I throw a piece in here and just break it to the number 2 hole, number 5. If I do that, it's going to be the exact same bend. So rather than try and play the deal with a square and following the graduations on there and trying to get it to a certain degree, it's a heck of a lot easier if I just go to a generic bend, which that bend seems to be about, I don't know, 75, 80 degrees, which should work for what I'm trying to do here. I'm gonna lay it out, figure out where to start the next bend, and then rather than try and replicate it by degrees, I'm just gonna bend it to a 2 by 5. If I do that, it'll be the exact same angle. All right guys, I apologize because I'm probably not going to explain this very well. I'm not trying to give you a tutorial on how to bend tubing. There's some fantastic videos and websites out there to go over that, but I am going to show you what I did. So I put this piece, this is the piece right here on the bottom that I just bent. I set it down on the plan that I drew out. You probably can't see it, but there's a line in there that represents the top of where I need it to be in the chassis. I've got the piece of tubing running right on that line. It's perfectly parallel with that line. Then I have, this is a sample bend that I have that has a reference mark. That reference mark references this portion of the die. So that's a consistency. I know that if I line that up with this portion of the die and if I start bending, I'll follow the same track as that sample bend. So with this bottom piece bent where I want it to be, and over here it's lined up with my tick showing how far out I need to be. Then I put my sample bend over that. I transfer the mark on my sample bend to the piece of tubing that I just bent. Then I put that on the paper. Then I measure it off from center. Then I take that distance over to the other side. I mark it on my paper, and then I mark it on this tube. Now if I put the tube in the bender, if I line this up with the proper section on the die, and then if I bend it at that 5-2, then this should have the exact same bend as this one, and it should come out roughly, when it bends down, roughly to this tick mark. So that's what I'm gonna do now. I'm gonna go bend it and see how it looks. Now I've got this piece of tube in here. That line that I drew, you can't see it, but it's lined with the leading edge of my die. Now, once you've got more than one bend, one thing that you have to do is you have to make sure that this bend is in line with this die. Otherwise, your bends will be at different angles. So what I usually do is set my level. I usually have to shim bender up, like right there. So I put a screwdriver under the back there to get the tubing bender level. Now I can straddle my level on my bend there. So I rotated it, so now the level is level there, and it was level here. So that's about as straight as I'm gonna get it. Now I'm going to bend this to 2 by 5 like I showed you before, and that should have it come out at the exact same angle as this. Okay, so that was an absolute success. You see here, here's the mark from the first break. That's where it coincides on my layout. And then that is the point where I need it to just clear, which it does. Then you come over to the other side. This is the mark I had just made. That is the mark that it correlates to on the drawing. And then I just made this break at the 5 by 2 like I did on the other side. And right there is the mark that it needs to clear, which it does. So I'm extremely happy with that. Now what I need to do, because in order to do this I've got to move all the motorcycles out of the way and really take up a lot of space. I need to break the tubing bender back down, tuck it away underneath the workbench here, this is where it lives, and then put all the bikes back because it's about 10 o'clock at night and I need to have the bikes back in their spot before the wife gets home from work. Okay guys, that's my little video on how ridiculous it is to get my tubing bender out to have to bend some tube, but what you're willing to do when you want to have a hobby and you want to bend some tube and you don't have much space. Thanks for watching the video.